She didn't hear the motion light click on. She never heard anything anymore. Ruby Briggs moved through the dark the way she had learned to move through everything since she was 19 years old. Carefully, deliberately, reading the world through her feet, her fingertips, the subtle shift of air pressure against her skin. The motion sensor flooded the back lot of the Iron Wolves garage in cold white light, and she didn't flinch, didn't freeze, didn't even look up. She just kept moving because she hadn't heard it and had no reason to stop. She was 38 years old and she had been silent for 19 years. And she had learned that the world did not wait for people who hesitated. The lot stretched behind the garage like a graveyard of beautiful things. Motorcycles in various states of disassembly leaned against chain-link fencing. Engine blocks sat on wooden pallets like altars nobody prayed at anymore. Chrome fenders caught the motion light and threw it back in fragments. Cracked leather saddlebags. Exhaust pipes gone orange with surface rust. A transmission housing the size of a small child's torso cracked down the middle but still holding its shape through sheer stubbornness. Ruby's backpack was half full already. She worked quickly the way a woman works when she knows exactly what she needs and exactly how much time she probably has. A voltage regulator pulled from a pile of electrical components, checked with a small flashlight clenched between her teeth, set aside. A rear axle housing 12mm bore still usable. Two sealed bearings she found loose in a coffee can, which she shook carefully and held up to the light. Perfect. She placed them in the side pocket of her pack where they wouldn't rattle against the metal. Her hands were her instruments, calloused across the palms from 12 years of grip work, scarred on the right thumb from a soldering iron that had slipped on a night she was too tired to be working. Her nails were cut short and there was grease in the creases of her knuckles that she had stopped trying to fully scrub out somewhere around the age of 32. They were working hands. They were the most honest things about her. She found the motor housing near the back of the pile, half buried under a waterlogged cardboard box. A small DC electric motor, the kind used in commercial scooters with a cracked housing but intact internals. She knew by the weight and the way the shaft turned when she spun it with her thumb. Smooth, no grinding. The crack in the housing was cosmetic, and she could fix cosmetic. She set it carefully in the main compartment of her pack, nestled it against the voltage regulator with a folded rag between them so they wouldn't knock against each other on the walk home. She did not think about the fact that she was trespassing. She had thought about it plenty back in the apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with Danny asleep down the hall and the bills spread out in front of her like a hand of cards she could not win with. She had thought about it while she was lacing up her shoes. She had made a decision and she had come here, and now she was working, because thinking about things too long had never once paid a bill or fixed a broken wheel. Danny was 9 years old. He had brown eyes that still trusted the world, which was either the most heartbreaking thing about him or the most remarkable. Ruby had not decided which. He had been walking fine 18 months ago. He had been actually running down the sidewalk outside their apartment building, in the particular way small boys run when they are not running toward anything, just running, because legs are for running, and being 9 years old is reason enough. And then there had been a car and a driver who was looking at something on his phone, and a moment of impact that Ruby had not heard, but had felt through the soles of her feet standing at the kitchen window 40 feet away. She had felt it, the particular vibration of something going wrong in the world. Danny had survived. The doctors had used words like remarkable and fortunate, and in the same breath had used other words like incomplete injury and nerve compression and long-term prognosis with careful faces that meant they did not want to promise her things they could not deliver. He could feel both legs. He could feel everything in his legs, every ache, every temperature, change the pressure of a hand on his shin. His legs simply would not move the way he told them to move. The signals were sending and arriving, and something in between was broken in a way that might heal and might not. The wheelchair the church had donated was secondhand from a facility that had been closing down. The left front wheel pulled slightly right. The frame had been repaired once with the wrong grade of aluminum, and the repair was holding, but not well. Ruby had tightened every bolt she could find on it twice and shimmied the axle with a strip of rubber cut from an old inner tube, and it was better, but it was not good. It was not what Danny deserved. She had been saving for 4 months after the accident to buy parts to build him something better. A proper electric scooter, low to the ground, wide track for stability, With a joystick throttle he could work with his left hand and redundant braking on both grips. She had drawn the plans herself over a period of 6 weeks on graph paper at the kitchen table after Danny went to sleep. She had the mechanical knowledge. She had spent 12 years in Earl Boone's bicycle and small engine shop, fixing everything from 3-speed cruisers to electric cargo bikes to the occasional antique outboard motor someone would carry in looking hopeful. She knew tolerances, she knew load ratings, she knew which compromises were acceptable and which ones would fail you in the worst possible moment. What she did not have was parts. Earl Boone's shop had closed 4 months ago, not because Earl was a bad businessman or had made bad decisions. He had simply been renting a space in a building that was sold to a developer who wanted to build apartments, and the new owner had tripled the rent in a single notice, and that was the end of 22 years of business on that corner of Broadway. Earl had cried when he locked the door for the last time. Ruby had stood beside him and put her hand on his arm, and he had covered her hand with his own calloused one, and they had stood like that for a while in the way people stand when words are not enough and words are all they have left. She had her last paycheck in her savings and the medical bills that had not been fully covered by the insurance that she had managed to keep through the shop barely for the last 2 years of employment. The numbers did not add up. They had not been adding up for months, and she had been bridging the gap with the last of what her parents had left her when they passed, her mother from cancer 6 years ago and her father from a heart attack 2 years after that, and that bridge was now gone. She had 3 weeks before the rent was due. She had a brother who counted ceiling cracks. She had plans on graph paper and hands that knew what to do and no parts to do it with. The Iron Wolves garage was 4 blocks from the apartment. She had walked past it 600 times. She knew they had a scrap pile in the back lot because she had seen members throwing things over the fence on her way to the laundromat. She had told herself for 3 weeks that she was not going to do this. And then she had looked at Danny's drawing, the one he had taped to the wall beside his bed, the one he had drawn in colored pencil of himself on a vehicle she recognized from her own plans, and she had put on her shoes. She was reaching for a handlebar grip wedged under a tangle of old cables when the hand closed on her shoulder. She felt it before she understood it. A sudden weight and pressure spinning her around, and she was facing a man who was talking at her with the particular fast-moving mouth of someone who was angry and expecting an answer. He was maybe 26, heavy-set, with a patchy beard and a leather vest with a prospect patch on the breast. His eyes were wide and his jaw was set, and he was still talking words she could not hear, and she understood immediately that she was in serious trouble. She held up both hands, palms out. The man did not stop talking. She reached slowly, watching his eyes, and unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and found the small notepad she kept there, the one with the pen clipped to the spiral binding. She tore out a page and pressed it against her palm and wrote 4 words. She held it up to his face. He read it. His mouth stopped moving. He read it again. The paper said, "I am deaf. Please." He stared at her. She watched him process it, watched the anger recede slightly, and something more complicated move in behind it. He was young enough to not know what to do with complicated. He looked at her backpack, then at the parts behind her, then back at her face. She turned the paper over and wrote on the back, "I was only taking from the scrap pile, not from the shop. I can put it all back." He shook his head and made a gesture she understood. "Stay here." He pointed at the ground with 2 fingers and looked at her with an expression that said he was serious, and then he turned and walked quickly toward the garage. Ruby stood in the white light of the motion sensor and considered running. She was fast. She had always been fast on her feet, had learned early that a woman who cannot hear approaching footsteps needs to be able to move the moment she decides to move. She looked at the fence, looked at the gate, looked at the backpack on her shoulders with 4 months of searching and planning inside it. She stayed. The man came back with another man, and this one was different in every way that mattered. He was somewhere around 58, maybe 60, with a gray beard cut close and eyes the particular color of good steel, neither blue nor gray, but something between the two that was both colder and more intelligent than either. He was broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had not been trying to stay that way, but simply had never stopped working. His leather vest was worn butter soft with age, and the patch on the back read Iron Wolves MC, with a chapter rocker underneath that said Tucson. He looked at Ruby for a long moment, not at her backpack or the parts behind her, at her face. Then he held out his hand, palm up, and looked at the notepad still in her hand. She gave it to him. He read both sides, turned it over, read it again. Then he held the pen back out to her and pointed at the blank space below her last sentence. She wrote, "I'm building something for my brother. He's 9. He can't walk. I needed the parts. I'm sorry." He read it, looked at her hands, specifically at her hands, the calloused palms, in the burn scar, in the grease that 12 years of honest work had pressed permanently into the skin. He wrote something back on the pad and handed it to her. It is said, "What are you building?" She reached into the main compartment of her backpack, past the motor and the regulator, and pulled out the folded stack of graph paper. She held it out. He took it. He unfolded it slowly, spreading each sheet on top of the one before it. He had 6 sheets of design, each one detailed to a degree that required him to look twice before understanding what he was looking at. Load distribution calculations in the margins. Gear ratios worked out in pencil. A steering geometry diagram that reflected a specific understanding of how a low center of gravity vehicle behaved at low speeds on imperfect surfaces. Material specifications. Weld joint placements. Notes in her small, very precise handwriting about tolerances and safety margins. He stood in the cold white light and read every page. Ruby watched his face. She had learned to read faces the way hearing people read voices. The small movements of the muscles around the eyes, the degree of tension in the jaw, the way a man's lips press together when he is genuinely surprised versus merely pretending to be. This man's face was doing something she had not expected when she handed him the papers. It was going still. Not blank. Still. The kind of stillness that comes when something catches a person who was not expecting to be caught. He folded the papers carefully back in the order he had found them and held them out to her. Then he pointed at a broken engine on a workbench near the garage entrance. He held up his hand in a gesture that needed no translation. Wait. He walked to the workbench and returned with a component she recognized immediately. A throttle cable assembly from a small 4-stroke engine, older model, with a specific kind of binding issue that came from a kink in the housing near the elbow. He held it out to her. She understood. She took it. She sat down on an upturned crate, the cold of the aluminum coming through her jeans, and she worked. She found the kink in the housing by feel her fingers running the length of the cable the way a musician runs a scale. She stripped the outer housing back with a multi-tool from her belt, found the frayed inner cable, checked the end fitting. She did not have the right fitting to replace it, but she had something close in the small parts tin she kept in the bottom of her pack, a fitting that was a 1/4 millimeter off but would serve. She worked the cable free, replaced the section, reinstalled the housing, tested the travel by drawing the cable through the full range of motion with her thumb and watching for binding. 8 minutes. She stood and handed the assembly back to him. He tested it himself, drew the cable through the range, let it return, drew it again. His face did that still thing again. He wrote on the pad, "How long have you been a mechanic?" She wrote, 12 years. Bicycles and small engines. "I'm mostly self-taught on the electrical side." He wrote, "Who taught you to draw plans like that?" She wrote, "Nobody. I watched. I read. I made a lot of mistakes first." He looked at that for a moment. Then he wrote, "How old is your brother?" She wrote, 9. "His name is Danny. He can feel his legs, but they won't move. The chair he has is borrowed and it's bad. I've been planning this for 4 months. I just ran out of time to keep waiting for money I can't earn fast enough." He stood with the notepad for a moment reading that last sentence. Then he looked up at the sky just briefly, the way a man looks up when he is talking to something or someone nobody else can see. His jaw moved slightly. Then he looked back at her. He wrote one thing, "How many parts do you still need?" She stared at that for a moment. She turned to a blank page of graph paper, the last sheet, and wrote a list. She wrote from memory because she had been carrying the list in her head for 4 months. Frame tubing 3 lengths, steering knuckle small, drive chain 40 link, front wheel assembly 8-inch. She kept writing. When she was done, the list was 17 items. He read the whole list without changing his expression. Then he capped the pen, handed her back the notepad and all her papers, and walked into the garage without looking back. The young prospect, Nate, stood a few feet away, watching her with his arms crossed and his expression somewhere between suspicious and uncertain. Ruby looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them knew what was supposed to happen next. Then every light in the building came on. Not just the work lights, every fluorescent in the main bay, the overheads in the storage room, the old incandescent above the side door that had probably not been turned on in months. The building went from dark to blazing, and through the dirty glass of the side window, Ruby could see movement, could see the shapes of men being summoned, could see them coming in from the parking lot and from a back room and from wherever men go when they are not working. Nate looked at the window and then back at Ruby with an expression that had lost all of its suspicion and replaced it with something she recognized after a moment as awe. She stood in the cold lot with her backpack and her plans and did not move. Cole Hendricks stood at the head of the workbench in the center of the Iron Wolves main bay and looked at the men arranged in a loose semicircle around him. 43 of them at various stages of whatever they had been doing before he called them in. Some with coffee cups, one still holding a wrench. The youngest was 22 and the oldest was Trigger, who was 52 and had one hand and the permanent expression of a man who had recalibrated his expectations about what life owed him and come out ahead. Cole spread the graph paper across the workbench. He did not explain who had drawn it or where it had come from. He let them look. He watched them move in closer. Watched the ones who understood mechanical drawing start to trace the lines with their eyes. And their fingers watched the ones who didn't understand it, watch the ones who did. He gave them 2 minutes. Then he said, "We're building this. Who's in?" He told it later to Ruby, written in his careful block letters on the notepad. There was no pause. Not a single beat of hesitation. 43 hands went up at the same moment like a single decision made by a single organism. And the sound of it, 43 men shifting their weight and lifting their arms in a room that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, was not loud, but it was absolute. Ruby was still standing in the lot when Nate came back out to get her. He didn't say anything, which was appropriate since she wouldn't have heard it anyway. He just tilted his head toward the garage door and held it open. She walked in. The first thing she saw was the men, not the bikes or the tools or the size of the space, though all of those were significant. The men, 43 of them in leather and denim and work boots, with faces that had accumulated weather and decision and consequence, and every one of them was looking at her with something she had not seen directed at herself in a very long time. Not pity, not the particular careful courtesy people extended to her when they learned she was deaf, that tilted head, slightly too slow enunciation. Not the discomfort of people who did not know where to put their eyes. They were looking at her the way men look at someone who has just demonstrated that they know what they are doing. Cole stood at the workbench with her plans spread out. He pointed at the plans, then at her, then at the space around him, and made a gesture that encompassed the garage, the tools, the men, everything. His meaning was clear enough that it required no translation. Ruby set her backpack down on the concrete floor. She pulled out the graph paper and spread it next to Cole's copy, smoothing the edges carefully. She picked up a pencil from the tin on the workbench and turned to the nearest man, who was Trigger, and pointed at the motor housing she had pulled from the scrap pile, which was sitting on the corner of the workbench. She wrote on a fresh page, "This is the motor. It needs a new housing cast around the existing internals. Do you have aluminum stock?" Trigger read, it looked at her, looked at the motor, and nodded once. She wrote, "Can you cast?" He held up his remaining hand, palm up, and wiggled his fingers. She understood this to mean something like, "Can a fish swim?" She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Cole tapped her shoulder gently, the way a person taps a deaf person's shoulder when they know what they are doing. She turned. He held out a new page of the notepad. He had written, "There's a room in the back. Table light. Can we bring your brother here tomorrow so we can fit the seat properly?" She read it twice. She had come here at 11 o'clock at night as a trespasser with a backpack of stolen parts and 4 months of desperation folded into her graph paper plans. And this man was asking if she could bring her 9-year-old brother tomorrow so they could fit the seat properly. She wrote, "He goes to school until 3. Cole wrote 3:30 works. She wrote, "He'll want to see the motorcycles." Cole's face did the still thing again. Then very briefly, the corner of his mouth moved upward. He wrote, "We can arrange that." Ruby Briggs looked around the Iron Wolves garage. The tool chest against the far wall, red and chrome, taller than she was. The welding station in the corner with its acetylene tanks and its MIG setup, and the dark scarring on the concrete floor from decades of hot metal. The motorcycles in various states of work, each one a project, each one somebody's ongoing conversation with what was possible. The 43 men who had held up their hands without hesitation because their president had spread a deaf woman's plans on a workbench and asked a single question. She had walked in here with the intention of taking what she needed and leaving before anyone noticed. She had not expected this. She looked back at Cole. She wrote one word, "Why?" He took the notepad. He looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote something and handed it back. It said, "Because those plans are real, and your brother counts ceiling cracks. And sometimes the right answer is just yes." She read it twice the way she read everything that mattered, letting the words settle into her at the pace they deserved. Then she folded the paper carefully and put it in the front pocket of her jacket, close to where she kept the graph paper, close to where she kept the things she intended to hold on to. She picked up her pencil. She got to work. Outside, Tucson breathed its cold November air through the chain-link fence, and the motion light clicked off. Its job done, the intruder identified and accounted for, the emergency resolved in a way that no sensor could have predicted and no protocol could have anticipated. Inside, under the blaze of 43 fluorescent bulbs, a woman who had not been able to trust the world with very much for a very long time began to learn what it felt like when the world showed up anyway. The next morning, Ruby walked Danny to school the way she always did, pushing the borrowed wheelchair. The 4 blocks to Saguaro Elementary, while the November sun came up pale and thin over the Rincon Mountains. Danny had his backpack on his lap and his Spider-Man thermos wedged between his knees, and he was talking the way he always talked in the mornings, a continuous low-level narration about whatever was moving through his 9-year-old mind. Ruby could read about a third of it from his profile as she pushed catching words when he turned his head. She got enough. She always got enough with Danny. He turned fully around at the corner of 5th and Grant, which he knew she needed him to do when he wanted her to actually understand something, and he signed, "You came home late." She signed back, "I went for a walk." He looked at her with the particular expression he had inherited from nobody she could identify, a look of patient and complete skepticism that seemed too old for his face. He signed a 4-hour walk. She signed it was a long block. He turned back around and she could see from the set of his small shoulders that he was deciding not to push it. He had learned in the 18 months since the accident when to push and when to let things come to him. He had learned a great deal of things in those 18 months that no 9-year-old should have needed to learn. He carried them without complaint, which was either a testament to his character or an indictment of everything that had happened to him, and Ruby had not yet decided which. At the school gate, he reached back and found her hand with his and held it for a moment without turning around. Then he let go and rolled himself through the gate, negotiating the slight bump in the concrete with the practiced tilt he had developed over months of repetition, and was absorbed into the morning crowd of children. Ruby stood at the gate until he was inside. Then she turned and walked the 4 blocks back to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the graph paper and a cup of coffee, and allowed herself for the first time to believe that this might actually happen. She was at the Iron Wolves garage at 8:30 that morning. She had not been told to come at 8:30, but the side door was unlocked and there was fresh coffee in the machine in the break room, which she took as an invitation. Cole was already there. He was at the workbench with her plans spread out and a legal pad beside them filled with notes in his block handwriting. He looked up when she came in, nodded once, and pointed at the stool beside the workbench. She sat down. He slid the legal pad toward her. He had broken the build into phases: frame fabrication first, then drivetrain, then electrical, then finishing. He had assigned each phase to specific members based on their skills. He had identified the 3 components from her list that were not available in the scrap pile and would need to be sourced, and beside each one, he had written a name and a note. Trigger front wheel assembly has a contact in Phoenix. Mama Lou frame tubing knows a supplier in Marana who owes us a favor. Church battery pack, Detroit. Ruby read through everything twice. Then she picked up the pen and wrote in the margin beside the drivetrain section, "The chain pitch matters here. It has to match the sprocket on the motor or it will skip under load. Standard 420 pitch, not 415. Cole read that, nodded, wrote 420 pitch on his own list, and circled it. They worked like that for an hour before anyone else arrived. Back and forth on the legal pad, the 2 of them building a shared language out of specifications and questions and answers. And Ruby noticed at some point that she was not writing "please" and "thank you" the way she usually did with new people, not adding the small, cushioning words that she had learned hearing people needed when they could not read her face for warmth. She was just writing what needed to be said, and Cole was reading it and responding in kind, and the absence of cushioning felt like respect. The members arrived in ones and twos over the course of the morning. Each one came to the workbench. First looked at the plans, asked Cole something, or checked the assignment list, and then went to work. There was no ceremony about it, no team meeting or formal introduction, just men arriving and finding their place in a thing that had already been set in motion. Trigger came in at 9:15. He was 52 years old and built like a man who had been strong once and had never entirely stopped being strong despite everything. He had lost his right arm below the elbow in 2015, a lathe accident at the machine shop where he had worked for 16 years, the kind of accident that happens in 1 second and then is simply the new permanent shape of your life. He had a prosthetic he wore sometimes, and a hook attachment he wore for shop work, and a habit of using his residual limb as a lever and a brace that was so practiced it no longer looked like adaptation. It just looked like how he worked. He pulled up a stool across from Ruby at the workbench and picked up one of her design sheets and looked at it for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at her and pointed at the steering geometry diagram and made a small rocking motion with his remaining hand. She understood. She picked up the pen and drew a quick note beside the diagram. The caster angle is 15 degrees. It will want to self-center at low speeds, which is what we want. At higher speeds, it will feel very stable. He is 9 and light, and his upper body strength is good, so he can handle the steering response. Trigger read that, nodded slowly, and then picked up the pen and wrote back in large, clear letters, "How do you know his upper body strength is good?" She smiled for the first time, a small one but real. She wrote, "He does pull-ups on the bar in the bathroom doorway every morning. 6 of them. He started in the hospital, and he has never stopped." Trigger read that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote, "Good kid." She wrote, "The best one I know." He looked at that and then nodded once more with a finality that meant the subject was settled and they could get to work. What followed in that first week was something Ruby did not have a word for and could not have explained in the notepad or the graph paper or any of the languages she had available to her. It was the feeling of a thing being built that was larger than its parts. She knew how to build things. She had been building and repairing things since she was 20 years old, had understood intuitively from her first year at Earl's shop that there was a particular satisfaction in mechanical work, that nothing else provided the satisfaction of problems that could be solved with correct knowledge and patient hands. She had always worked alone. She had preferred it, or believed she preferred it, because working alone meant she controlled the pace and the communication and the thousand small negotiations that hearing people conducted constantly without noticing. This was different. Trigger taught her things she had not known she needed to know. He had decades of metalwork in his one remaining hand, and he communicated in the way a man communicates when words have always been secondary to him, through demonstration and gesture, and the particular expressiveness of someone who had learned to let his hands do the talking long before the accident gave him a reason to. He showed her how to read the color of mild steel as it heated under the torch, the progression from black through dark red to orange to the white-yellow at welding temperature, how to hold the weld pool at the right viscosity by controlling distance and angle. He corrected her technique not by taking the torch away, but by positioning his hand over hers and guiding the movement, and she felt the correction in her wrist and shoulder before she understood it in her mind. She showed him things too, the electrical diagrams, the way she had designed the redundant braking system, the particular solution she had found for the throttle calibration that accounted for the fact that Danny's left hand had slightly less grip strength than his right due to a secondary injury from the accident. Trigger could not have designed any of that, but he could read it once she showed him and understand it, and his questions were always the right questions, the ones that caught the places where her thinking had been almost right, but not entirely right, and made the design better. They did not need much language for any of it. They needed hands and eyes and the willingness to be wrong and corrected, and they both had those. Danny came to the garage on the second day as arranged. Ruby had told him that morning at breakfast, signing across the table while his cereal went soft, "We are going somewhere after school today." He had asked where, and she had told him. He had put down his spoon. He signed the motorcycle place. She signed yes. He signed the scary one on Miracle Mile. She signed they are not scary. She paused. They are a little scary. but not to us. He had thought about this for a moment and then picked up his spoon again, which meant he had filed it and accepted it and moved on, which was how Danny processed most things. When Ruby pushed him through the garage side door at 3:40 that afternoon, Danny went completely still in the wheelchair. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone who has just encountered something so far beyond their expectation that their entire system has paused to take it in. The motorcycles were lined against the far wall, Harleys and custom builds, and one Indian that was so old it might have been original, all of them gleaming under the overheads with the particular presence that machines have when they are both functional and beautiful. Chrome and leather and paint in colors that had names like midnight and copper and bone. Danny's mouth was open. Trigger appeared from the welding station and walked across the garage floor and lowered himself onto one knee in front of the wheelchair, which put him at eye level with Danny, and looked at him steadily. He held out his remaining hand. Danny looked at the hand and at the prosthetic on the other arm, and then he reached out and shook the offered hand with both of his own small ones. Trigger said something. Ruby caught the tail end of it enough to understand he had asked Danny his name. Danny said his name. Then he signed it to Ruby simultaneously, a habit they had developed together, so she never missed what he said to other people. Trigger reached out with his prosthetic arm and bumped it gently against the armrest of Danny's wheelchair. A small, deliberate gesture. Hey, we both have equipment. Danny looked at the prosthetic and looked at his chair, and something in his face changed in a way that Ruby had to look away from for a moment because it was too much to take head on. Mama Lou arrived 20 minutes later with a measuring tape and a clipboard and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She was 67 years old and had been the organizing principal of the Iron Wolves in all the ways that did not involve engines or leather for 31 years. Her husband Gerald had been a founding member and had died of a heart attack in the garage he loved in 2019. And Mama Lou had continued to show up because the club was her family, and family did not stop showing up because someone died, it showed up more. She introduced herself to Danny by crouching down and holding out her hand, and then unprompted signing hello, in the careful way of someone who had looked it up. Danny's face opened up completely. He signed back hello and told her she was doing it right, and Mama Lou laughed a sound so full and unself-conscious that Ruby could feel it in the air and in the vibration of the concrete floor. Mama Lou took measurements. Danny's torso length and reach, in the precise angle of his spine in the sitting position. She measured the distance from his hip to his shoulder blade, and from his shoulder to the natural resting position of his forearm. She was thorough, and she explained everything she was doing to Danny directly, and Danny watched her with his full serious attention and answered her questions about what felt comfortable and what did not, with the precision of a child who had been asked about his body by medical professionals enough times that he had learned to be accurate. When she was done, she stood up and looked at Ruby across the top of Danny's head. She said something slowly and clearly enough that Ruby caught most of it. She said he knows his body very well. Ruby signed to Danny. She says, "You know your body." Danny signed back, matter-of-factly, "I have to. Nobody else can feel it." Ruby translated that on the notepad. Mama Lou read it and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Still clearly wise boy." The build proceeded through the first week with the particular momentum of a project that has found its right people. The frame came together in the welding station under Trigger's hands, and Ruby's the mild steel tubing cut to length and fitted and tacked and then welded full each joint, ground smooth and checked. The front wheel assembly arrived on Thursday from Trigger's contact in Phoenix, the right size and bearing grade, and Ruby fitted it to the front fork the same evening and checked the steering sweep, and it was correct to within a millimeter of spec. Cole was present every day, not directing in the way of a man who needed to be seen to be in charge, but present in the way of someone whose presence was itself a form of organization. He checked the work. He sourced things. He solved problems that required phone calls or connections, or the particular kind of authority that came from being who he was in this city. When Ruby needed a specific grade of aluminum for the seat support brackets and the supplier in Marana could not provide it in the right temper, it was Cole who made a call at 7 in the morning and had the material delivered by noon. On the evening of the 8th day, Cole was at the workbench alone when Danny spotted the jacket. It was hanging on a hook near the back of the storage room, visible through the open door. Old leather black with an Iron Wolves back patch that was different from the current design, older the lettering in a font the club had used years before. It was not in use. It was simply hanging there in the way things hang in places where people have been for a long time, accumulating significance without anyone deciding to give them any. Danny pointed. He signed to Ruby that jacket. It is old. Ruby looked. She looked at Cole, pointed at the jacket, made a questioning gesture. Cole went still. Not the stillness she had learned to recognize as concentration or consideration. A different kind of stillness. The kind that has weight to it. He walked to the storage room doorway and stood looking at the jacket for a moment. Then he took it off the hook and brought it back to the workbench and laid it flat under the light. He turned the collar down. On the inside of the collar in faded marker, someone had written a name in a teenager's irregular hand. Jake H. Cole stood with his hands on the workbench on either side of the jacket. He was looking at it, but Ruby understood that he was not seeing the workbench or the garage or any of the present moment. He was somewhere else entirely. She did not touch him or interrupt him. She waited. After a moment, he picked up the pen. He wrote, "This belonged to my son, Jake. He was 19 when he gave it away. He gave it to a kid in this neighborhood. A boy who used to hang around the garage, maybe 7 or 8 years old. This was 2008. I have been looking at this jacket on that hook for 15 years, wondering what happened to that kid." Ruby read it. She read it twice. She looked at Danny. Danny was looking at the jacket with an expression she could not immediately read. He was signing something to himself, small movements close to his lap, the way he signed when he was thinking rather than communicating. She touched his arm. She signed what? He looked up at her. He signed slowly. Papa had a jacket, a black one, with the wolf on the back. He kept it in the box under the bed. I saw it when I was little. He said a man gave it to him when he was small. He said the man told him to keep it for when he was big enough. Ruby felt the ground shift under her. She picked up the pen. She wrote Danny's father. My brother's father, he grew up 4 blocks from here. He died in 2019. He had a motorcycle club jacket in a box under the bed, black leather, wolf on the back. She pushed the notepad to Cole. He read it. He looked at Danny. He looked at the marker on the collar. Jake H. He looked at Ruby. He sat down on the stool, which was not something she had seen him do at the workbench before. He sat down and put both hands flat on the workbench and looked at the space between them. Ruby did not write anything. Some things were not for notepads. Mama Lou appeared in the garage entrance at that moment carrying a covered dish and accompanied by Nate, who was holding the door. She read the room immediately the way Mama Lou always read rooms, and she set the dish down quietly and stayed near the door. It was Danny who broke it. He wheeled himself forward to the workbench and reached up and touched the collar of the jacket, the faded marker letters very gently with 2 fingers. Then he looked at Cole and said something that Ruby caught completely because he spoke slowly and clearly and directly to her face the way he always did when he wanted to make sure she heard him. He said, "So your son gave my dad his jacket, and now we are here building my chair." Cole looked at this 9-year-old boy for a long time. He picked up the pen. He wrote something and showed it to Danny, reading it aloud at the same time so Ruby could catch it. It said, "Yeah, son, that's exactly right." Danny nodded once with great seriousness, the way he nodded when something had been confirmed that he had already suspected. Then he turned back to the build and pointed at the frame on the workbench and signed to Ruby, "Can I help sand it?" Ruby looked at Trigger. Trigger handed Danny a sheet of 200 grit without being asked. 3 days later, Sharon Weaver knocked on the garage side door at 4 in the afternoon. Ruby did not hear the knock. She was at the welding station with the face shield down, laying the final bead on the rear axle bracket, and she did not know anyone had arrived until she lifted the shield and turned around and found Cole standing at the door talking to a woman in a gray blazer with a briefcase and the particular expression of a person who has come prepared to be difficult. Ruby understood what she was looking at before anyone told her. She knew that expression. She had seen it twice in the hospital in the days after Danny's accident, the careful professional courtesy that was not discourteous, but that carried behind it the implication of authority and the possibility of removal. She had dreaded it every day since. She set down the welding torch and walked across the garage floor. Cole turned and looked at her with an expression he was working to keep controlled and handed her the notepad. He had written, "Her name is Sharon Weaver. She is from Child Protective Services. She says she has received an anonymous report that Danny has been left unsupervised on multiple evenings while you are here." Ruby stood with a notepad and did not move. She thought about the night she had stayed until 9 or 10 working on the build, while Danny was with Mama Lou 3 blocks away, safe-fed, watched over by a woman who had been caring for other people's children informally for 30 years. She thought about her landlord, Harold Pratt, 61 years old, whose face had closed the day she told him she would need 30 more days to make up the difference in rent. Sharon Weaver was talking. Ruby caught fragments. Concerned about welfare. Required to investigate. Standard procedure. Ruby looked at Cole. He gave a small nod. The kind that meant, I have this if you will let me. She stepped back. Mama Lou appeared from the break room before Cole could speak. She walked directly to Sharon Weaver and stood in front of her and said something brief. Then she turned and looked at the garage, and without raising her voice said something that caused every man in the building to stop what he was doing. What followed was not confrontational. Mama Lou walked Sharon Weaver slowly around the perimeter of the garage. She stopped at the welding station. She stopped at the workbench where the build sat, the frame and the drivetrain and the seat mounts, in the beginning of something real and deliberate and safe. She stopped at Trigger, who put down his tools and stood up straight and said something Ruby did not catch, but which lasted 30 seconds and during which Sharon Weaver looked at the floor. Cole flanked the conversation the entire time, not speaking, simply present. 43 members of the Iron Wolves standing in their own garage, not aggressive, not threatening, simply occupying the space they occupied and making clear that this space held something they had decided to protect. Sharon Weaver left 40 minutes later. Before she reached the door, she turned and said something directly to Ruby slowly enough to catch no further action required at this time. Ruby watched her go. Mama Lou stopped in front of her and spoke clearly. Your landlord filed the report this morning. The report has been noted as unfounded. Cole called his attorney an hour ago. The attorney called your landlord 20 minutes ago. She paused. Your landlord will not be filing anything else. Ruby looked at her. Mama Lou said you have 30 days to find a new place, fully documented, no harassment. Cole is covering the deposit. Ruby shook her head immediately. Mama Lou said it is not a gift. You will pay it back when you are able. That is the arrangement. She said it with the finality of someone who has already decided and is simply informing. Ruby took the notepad. She wrote, I don't know how to thank you. Mama Lou took the pen. She wrote back without hesitation. Build the chair. That's all the thanks there is. That evening, after Danny had been dropped off at the apartment and Ruby had walked back to the garage alone, because she could not yet sleep, she found Mama Lou sitting on the front step with 2 cups of coffee. Mama Lou held one out without getting up. Ruby sat beside her on the step. The November night was cold and clear, with a sky full of stars that the city had not entirely erased. They sat with their coffees, and Ruby could feel the faint vibration of music from somewhere down the block, and the deeper pulse of a motorcycle engine on Miracle Mile winding through its gears. Mama Lou said something. Ruby turned to catch it. She repeated it slowly. I had a daughter. Her name was Caroline. She had muscular dystrophy. She died when she was 17. I used to push her chair and think she should be the one pushing me one day. That's the order of things. Ruby sat with that. Mama Lou said, when Cole spread those plans on that table, I thought, this is why. This is what all of it was for. Gerald dying in here. Jake on that road. Trigger losing his arm. All of it leading somewhere. She paused. I know that is probably foolish. Ruby shook her head. She took the notepad from her jacket pocket and wrote, it is not foolish. Some things make sense backwards. Mama Lou read that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the way people nod when something has said what they needed said. They sat on the step until their coffee was gone. 2 women in the November cold and the stars over Tucson were very clear, and the motorcycle on Miracle Mile had faded away to silence somewhere to the north, and the build waited inside for the morning. On the 14th day, the chair was done. Ruby stood in front of it alone at 2 in the morning, the garage quiet around her, the last man having left an hour earlier. Cole had locked the front and left the side door open for her the way he had left it open every night for 2 weeks. She stood with both hands on the frame, feeling the cold of the steel through her palms, the precision of the welds, the solidity of something that had been planned and measured and built to a specific human body in a specific human life. The frame was matte black, powder-coated over bare steel. The front forks were polished to a degree Nate had insisted on spending 3 hours with progressively finer compound until they caught light the way chrome caught light. The seat was custom upholstered in black leather with red stitching by a member named Walt, who had learned leatherwork in prison 20 years ago and had never stopped because it turned out he had a gift for it. The joystick throttle was mounted on the left, calibrated to Danny's grip strength with a second braking input on the right grip for redundancy. The wheel hubs were machined by a trigger to tolerances Ruby had specified, and the chain ran true on first spin, the 420 pitch engaging the motor sprocket with a precision that made no sound at all. Across the frame in the script that Ruby had spent 6 nights stenciling, and Nate had spent 2 nights painting with an airbrush the size of a pen, the name ran the full length of the chassis in a red that was 1 shade darker than the stitching chosen specifically so that it would read differently in different light, almost brown in shadow and fully red in sun. Thunder. She had not told Danny the name. She had kept it back because she wanted him to see it and name it himself, and she had been certain, with the certainty of someone who knows another person completely, that he would arrive at the same word she had. She stood with her hands on the frame at 2 in the morning, and she was not thinking about the apartment or the bills or the 4 months of planning or the night she had climbed a fence she had no right to climb. She was thinking about a small boy who had stood up from a fall in a parking lot years before any of this dusted his palms and walked on without a backward look. She was thinking about the particular quality of his courage, which had always been there, and which the accident had not diminished, and which she had been trying to protect and enable and amplify since the day he was born. She was not building this chair for Danny. She understood that now, standing alone in the quiet garage at 2 in the morning. She had been building it the entire time for the boy who was already there inside him, the one who did pull-ups in the doorway, the one who named his own courage in colored pencil on the wall beside his bed, the one who had looked at Cole Hendricks across a workbench and said with all the certainty of a person who has thought it through, "So your son gave my dad his jacket, and now we are here." She stood with her hands on the frame, and for the first time in 18 months, she did not feel like she was losing ground. She felt like she had made something true. Ruby was already awake when the alarm went off. She had been lying still for an hour, not from sleeplessness, but from the particular alertness that comes before something you have been moving toward for a long time. She felt the apartment around her, the furnace through the floor, the pre-dawn stillness of a city not yet moving. She got up and dressed in the dark without needing the light. She had packed Danny's bag the night before. She had laid out his good jeans and his blue flannel on the chair by his door. She had done everything she could do in advance, because today she did not want to rush a single moment. Danny was sitting up when she pushed open his door. His hands were in his lap and his eyes were very clear, which meant he had been awake for a while. He signed today. She signed today. He was quiet for a moment. Then he signed, "What is it like?" Riding. She knew he meant on a motorcycle, the real kind, the kind he had watched in videos for 2 years, with his face doing the things she could not name. She considered this honestly the way she always tried to answer Danny's real questions. She signed it as like being very fast and very still at the same time. Like the world is moving around you, but you are the center of it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod that meant he had filed it away as true. She signed, "Eat breakfast. Then we go." Mama Lou had been awake since 4:30. She had biscuits in the oven and a pot of gravy on the stove and coffee strong enough to require no argument. And when the first members began arriving at the garage at 7, she put a plate in front of each one of them without asking. Cole arrived at 7:15 and stood in the doorway of the break room, and Mama Lou put a plate in front of him and poured his coffee and said, "Eat it." He ate it. Nate was there by 7:30, freshly pressed jeans and his prospect vest over a clean flannel. He had spent 2 hours the previous evening polishing the forks of the Thunder one final time, and this morning he had nothing left to do with his hands, so he kept moving through the garage, straightening things that did not need straightening. Trigger arrived on his bike, which he rode with hand controls he had designed and installed himself over the course of 6 months after the accident, the throttle and rear brake both remapped to his left hand and a custom grip extension for the front brake that he could actuate with his residual limb. He parked in the lineup with the others and sat for a moment after the engine cut, his face turned slightly toward the pale morning sky, doing the thing he did sometimes before something he considered significant. The Iron Wolves gathered over the course of that morning until all 43 were present. They came in and checked the lineup and drank coffee and talked in the way people talk when they are waiting for something important, with a seriousness that will not permit itself to become enthusiasm yet. The garage had the feeling of before, the particular compressed quality of time just prior to something that cannot be undone. Cole had laid out the route on a printed map on the workbench. 6 miles through the east side of Tucson, down Miracle Mile to 6th Avenue, through the Arts District, where the streets were wide and smooth out to the long, flat stretch of Broadway that would give Danny his first real open road moment, and ending at Morrison's Diner on the corner of Alvernon, where Mama Lou had arranged a private section. The road had been chosen for surface quality and traffic predictability. Cole had driven it twice the previous day and noted every significant crack and cross slope in a small notebook. He had arranged for 2 members on motorcycles to hold intersections at 4 points along the route. Ruby and Danny arrived at 9:15. Danny had worn his good jeans and his blue flannel and his Tucson Roadrunner's cap pushed back on his head the way he liked it. He was quiet in the van on the way over. Ruby had watched him in the mirror, and he was looking out the window with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was containing something large. When Mama Lou opened the side door of the van and Danny saw the 43 motorcycles in formation in the lot, all of them idling or ready, all of them facing the same direction, like something with a single purpose, he stopped moving for a moment. They brought him through the side door of the garage. The Thunder was covered with a white sheet in the center of the floor under the overheads. The 43 members of Iron Wolves formed a loose circle around it, not tight, not formal, just present. Cole stood at the head of the semicircle. Trigger was beside him. Mama Lou stayed near Danny's shoulder. Ruby stood at the edge of the circle and looked at her brother. He was looking at the shape under the sheet. His hands were in his lap, and he was very still. Cole nodded at her. She walked forward and took the edge of the sheet and pulled it away in a single motion. The Thunder sat under the overheads, and the light found every surface it had been built to find. The matte black frame absorbed the light and gave nothing back. The polished forks threw light in long, clean lines. The red stitching on the black leather seat was precise and deliberate. The chrome of the wheel hubs caught everything and held it. And across the frame in the script that had taken 9 nights to get right, the name ran the full length of the chassis in red that was one shade darker than the stitching. Thunder. Danny did not make a sound. He sat in the borrowed wheelchair and looked at the Thunder for a long time. His hands had come off his lap and were gripping the armrest, not from tension, but from the need to hold on to something while the rest of him adjusted to what he was seeing. Ruby signed to him, "Do you want to know the name?" He looked at her. He pointed at the script on the frame. He signed, "I can read it." She signed, "Do you know why?" He signed back slowly, working it out as he went, "Because you cannot hear it, but everybody else can." The garage was quiet around them. Ruby felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a name for in any language. She stood with it and let it be what it was. Trigger and Cole helped Danny transfer from the borrowed chair to the Thunder. They did it with the practiced ease of men who had thought through every step beforehand. Danny settled into the seat, and Ruby watched him feel the difference immediately, the way his spine aligned to the custom geometry, the way his hands found the grips without having to reach. Mama Lou adjusted the harness across his chest, and Danny sat up straighter in it than Ruby had seen him sit in 18 months. Cole crouched in front of him and showed him the controls one more time. Left joystick for throttle and direction. Right grip for primary brake. Left grip for secondary. Danny watched Cole's hands and then put his own hands on the controls and moved the joystick fractionally, and the Thunder rolled forward to 2 inches and stopped. Danny's face changed. Not the way faces change in movies. The way faces change when a person becomes certain of something they had only believed before. A settling, a coming to rest. His eyes went very clear, and he moved the joystick again a full inch this time, and the Thunder rolled smoothly forward, and he brought it back with the brake and stopped it on a line. He signed to Ruby, "It does exactly what I tell it to." She signed, "That is because it was built for you, not for anyone else." He looked at Cole and at Trigger and at Mama Lou and at the 43 men arranged in the garage around him, and he said aloud in his clear 9-year-old voice, "Thank you." Cole said something. Ruby caught the last of it. He said, "Thank you for letting us." Before the engine started, Cole came to her at the side of the garage away from the noise of preparation. He stood in front of her and put the notepad deliberately into his jacket pocket so she would understand he was not going to use it. She watched him. He raised his hands. What followed was the most careful signing she had ever witnessed from someone who had not grown up with it. Slower than a child's first attempts, and more deliberate than anything she had seen from an adult learner, each gesture held a half-beat longer than necessary, as if he was afraid it would not arrive correctly. She could see the concentration in his jaw, the way he checked each hand position before committing to it. He signed, "You were never invisible." He paused, his hands dropped slightly, then came back up. He signed, "We just were not listening the right way." He stopped. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has done something difficult in front of someone whose judgment matters to him and does not know how it landed. Ruby stood very still. She had been reading hands for 19 years. She had read the hands of people born into the language people whose fingers moved like water, and she had never once been moved by technical correctness. What moved her was not how well he signed. It was that he had taken 3 weeks of his own time in the margins of everything else he was carrying to learn how to say one thing to her without anyone in between. She signed back, "I know." He nodded once. That was enough for both of them. They rolled out at 10, Danny at the front, the Thunder's electric motor near silent against the bass rumble of 43 Harleys behind him. Cole rode directly behind Danny, not close enough to crowd far enough to respond if needed. Trigger flanked left. Nate flanked right. Ruby rode behind Cole on a borrowed touring model with a Cole's spare helmet painted matte black to match the Thunder. She settled into the seat and felt the engine come through the frame in waves, felt it in her femurs, in her sternum and the base of her skull, and she understood as they pulled out of the lot and onto Miracle Mile that this was going to be different from anything she had experienced before, because Danny was in front of her. She could see him clearly. His back straight in the custom seat, the Roadrunner's cab turned backward now to fit under the helmet. His hands on the controls with the confidence of someone who has been told by the machine itself that they belong there. He moved through the first intersection, cleanly holding his line, making the small adjustments that a rider makes without thinking. And Ruby watched him and felt the engine's vibration through her own body and understood that she was feeling what she could not hear. This was how she would know it, not through sound, but through resonance. The 43 machines behind her and around her, and this one small machine in front of her, all of them vibrating at frequencies she felt in her bones, and in the middle of it all, her brother riding at the front of something she had built for him out of plans drawn at a kitchen table at midnight with borrowed pencils and pure stubbornness. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. Just 2. Long enough to feel it without looking at it. Then she opened them and watched the road. They came down 6th Avenue into the Arts District, where the streets widened and the Saturday morning foot traffic had begun to gather at the sound of the procession. Ruby could see people turning. She could see phones coming up. She could see children pointing and adults stopping mid-stride, and the particular arrested quality of a crowd that has encountered something it was not prepared for. A girl at the front, not being carried or assisted. Leading, the Thunder at the head of 43 motorcycles, its red name catching the November sun, its operator, 9 years old and upright, and completely in command of the machine beneath him. She saw a woman outside a coffee shop put her hand over her mouth. She saw a man in a work jacket pull his hat off. That one hit her somewhere she had not anticipated being hit. They turned onto Broadway, and the street opened up. Cole pulled alongside Danny briefly, matching his pace, and Ruby watched them ride side by side for a moment, the massive Harley and the low, small Thunder, the 58-year-old man with his gray beard and his worn leather, and the 9-year-old boy with his cap backward in his straight spine. Then Cole fell back, and Danny was at the front again, and he opened the throttle. The Thunder moved out ahead of the procession with the quiet authority of an electric motor at full reach, and Ruby felt the gap open between her and Danny, and felt the instinct to close it, and then suppressed that instinct completely. He was not hers to chase. He was at the front of something. She let him be at the front. They let him run for 4 blocks before Cole accelerated the procession smoothly to match. By the time they reformed the formation, Danny was grinning so widely that Ruby could see it from 20 feet behind him without seeing his face. She knew the shape of his joy. She had always known the shape of it. It was Morrison's Diner, where Earl Boone was waiting. Ruby did not know he would be there. She did not see him until the procession stopped and the engines cut, in the sudden quiet of 43 motorcycles going silent at once. created a space in which everything else became visible. Earl was on the sidewalk. He had not come alone. Behind him stood 6 men Ruby recognized after a moment, the regulars from the shop. Dale, who brought his Schwinn in every spring. Marcus, who had the electric cargo bike she had rebuilt twice. Old Pete, who came in just to talk most of the time. They were standing on the sidewalk in their ordinary clothes, looking at the thunder with expressions that required no translation. Earl stepped forward when she crossed the lot toward him. He did not reach for a notepad. He did not hand her anything. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he raised his hands. He signed badly, slowly, with the uncertain hands of a man who had learned something in a hurry because he needed to say it the right way. "I am sorry. I should have done more." She stood with that. He kept his hands up. He signed one more thing even more carefully than the first, "You were the best." She looked at this 71-year-old man who had given her 12 years of work that she knew how to do and who had come to a parking lot on a Saturday morning with 6 regular customers and learned 3 sentences of a language that was not his own because he needed her to receive what he had to say directly. She signed back, "You taught me everything." That is not a small thing. He looked at his own hands as if surprised they had worked. The regulars behind him were watching. Old Pete had his cap in his hands. Then Earl reached into his jacket and held out an envelope. She took it. He said aloud, clearly for the new shop, "No name yet. You choose it. Build it the way you built that chair. That is the whole instruction." She held the envelope and looked at him. He nodded once. Then he stepped back and let her go. Inside, Morrison's Danny was already at the head of the longest table holding court with 3 members who had discovered that he could name every major motorcycle manufactured between 1945 and the present by make, model, and year from a photograph. Ruby sat beside him and ordered coffee and looked around the table at the faces she had learned over the past 3 weeks. Cole held up his phone across the table and tilted the screen toward her and tilted his head toward the door. She followed him out. In the parking lot, he showed her a message thread. It was from a name she did not recognize, Carolyn Briggs, Director of Operations, Rolling Forward Foundation, Flagstaff, Arizona. The message had come in that morning. It said that someone at the foundation had seen a video posted the previous evening, a 40-second clip of Danny leading the procession on Broadway, and the foundation's engineering director had watched it 4 times. The message said, "We have been trying to solve that weight distribution problem on pediatric mobility devices for 3 years. We have had 3 engineers look at it. Who designed that chair?" Cole had written back, a mechanic named Ruby Briggs, 38 years old, self-taught on the structural side. She designed it for her brother. The foundation's reply had come 40 minutes later. Would she be willing to talk to us? Not an interview, not a job offer. We want to learn from her. We want to know how she thought about it. Ruby read the exchange twice. She looked up at Cole. He had his pen out, but she shook her head. She did not need the notepad for this. She took the pen from his hand and wrote one thing on the back of the parking stub in his shirt pocket. Tuesday. He read it and put the stub back in his pocket, which was answer enough. She looked at him. The November sun was doing its work without making a case for itself. She had been standing in her own light for years without knowing it, she thought. Not invisible, just unlit. Just waiting for someone to turn toward her the way this man had turned toward her in a cold back lot 3 weeks ago, with her plans in his hand and his face going still, was something she had not recognized then, but recognized now. She had been recognized. They went back inside. That evening, after Danny was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Ruby sat at the kitchen table one more time. The graph paper was still there, and she spread it out and looked at the plans the way she looked at them now, not as a blueprint for something unmade, but as a record of something that had happened. She opened on the envelope from Earl. There was a check. She looked at the number and set it down and looked at it from a distance. It was not a solution to everything. It was a beginning, which was what Earl had said, and Earl had always been accurate about what things were. There was a folded note. She unfolded it. In Earl's handwriting, it said, "For the new shop. No name yet. You choose it. Whatever you build there, build it the way you built that chair." That is the whole instruction. She thought about this foundation's message. She thought about the weight distribution problem 3 engineers had not cracked in 3 years. And she thought about the solution she had found, not because she was more skilled than 3 engineers, but because she had known the specific person she was building 4 had known the angle of his spine in the sitting position and the grip strength of his left hand and the way he tilted right when he was tired. She had not solved an abstract problem. She had built a specific answer to a specific life. She thought, that is what I know how to do. That is the thing. She spread a fresh sheet of graph paper on the table and picked up a pencil, and she was already thinking about the next version. Not for Danny. Danny's was right. Danny's was done, but for the next one, whoever that was, whatever particular geometry of need they brought with them. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound. Not heard, felt. A small vibration through the floor down the hallway, the weight of the Thunder's wheels on the apartment linoleum moving toward her. She turned. Danny was in the doorway of the kitchen in his pajamas, the Thunder positioned precisely at the threshold, his hands easy on the controls. He had transferred himself in the night, in the dark by himself, the way he must have been rehearsing in his mind since the day he first sat in it. He looked at her. He signed, "I wanted to see if I could." She signed, and he rolled the Thunder through the doorway and brought it to the kitchen table and stopped it at his end, the place where his chair had always been. He looked at the fresh graph paper in front of her. He looked at the pencil in her hand. Then he looked at the empty chair across from him, which was her chair, which had been her chair for every midnight plan and every bill and every quiet crisis she had worked through alone at this table for the past 4 months. He signed, "What are you building next?" She sat down across from him. She looked at her brother in the machine she had built for him, 9 years old and straight-backed and unhurried, his brown eyes steady in the kitchen light, and she thought this. This is what I am building next. Not a thing, a direction. The next one and the one after that, and every specific life that arrives needing a specific answer. She put the pencil to the paper. Outside, Tucson was beginning its evening, the November sky going deep blue over the ring cones, and the graph paper was blank and waiting. And Ruby Briggs, who had not been able to hear the world for 19 years, put her free hand flat on the table and felt the faint vibration of the city beneath her palm and thought, I hear you. I have always heard you. I just needed the right people to be quiet long enough to let me answer. She drew the first line. In the garage on Miracle Mile, Cole Hendricks sat alone with the last of the coffee and the lights low and Jake's jacket on the workbench in front of him. He had brought it out from the storage room that afternoon and set it there, and now he was simply sitting with it, the way a man sits with the things that have lasted when so much else did not. He was not sad. That was the thing he kept coming back to. He had expected to sit with this jacket tonight and feel the old weight of it, the particular grief that had no season and did not diminish. Instead, he felt something he did not have a clean word for, something that had the quality of resolution without the quality of ending. Jake's jacket had traveled from this garage to a boy in this neighborhood, to a box under a bed, to a 9-year-old who had brought it back here without knowing he was bringing it back, and in the space that journey had crossed, a woman had built something extraordinary in this exact room, and a club of men who had forgotten some things about themselves had remembered them. He picked up his phone. He had a photograph taken by Nate Candid from the formation on Broadway. Danny at the front of the procession, the Thunder beneath him, the name in red catching the November sun. His back straight, his hands easy, his head up, looking at the road ahead of him. Cole had been looking at this photograph since noon. He thought about his daughter somewhere in the country who did not know his face well enough to trust it yet. He thought about the message he had sent her 3 weeks ago, with the photo of Danny in the garage surrounded by men who had decided to show up. She had replied, it was a beginning. Beginnings were enough. He put the phone down. He sat in the quiet garage and he allowed himself just briefly the thing he did not usually allow in front of anyone. He looked at the jacket on the workbench. He said quietly into the empty garage, I see it, Jake. I see exactly what you started. The building held the silence around those words for a moment. Then Cole Hendricks, who was not a man who made speeches or required witnesses, picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down, and turned off the overhead light. He drove home through the Tucson night with the jacket on the passenger seat beside him and the valley spread out below in its 10,000 lights, and he thought about what it meant to have something taken from you and have it returned, not restored, not replaced, but transformed into something that could not have existed without the loss. And he thought that this was not consolation, and it was not justice, and it was not a trade anyone would have chosen. It was simply what had happened. And what had happened was enough.